Coming to you once again from the Situation Room, this is Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello, and yes, we have a situation.
People were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy.
Wall Street surged today.
Lots of volatility, very different tone from what we got yesterday.
Companies are now doing the hard work of forecasting through a fog of uncertainty.
Stock and bond markets rebound, then recoil again after Trump's partial tariff pause, and the Supreme Court has weighed in on the Alien Enemies Act.
Also this week, Trump says he's not joking about an unconstitutional third term or, in fact, about making Canada the 51st state. So I guess that means he is joking, or he isn't, or he... Oh, I've got no idea. I'm so confused.
So, did Donald Trump just perform a humiliating retreat from the global trade war he started just last week, or was this always part of the plan? Who knows? But in the face of a volatile stock market and a panicked business sector, the Liberation Day tariffs on just about everyone, including penguins, were suddenly put on hold this week. It all played out on President Trump's Truth social media platform, which, by the way, has seen its own share price fall by more than a quarter in a fortnight, cutting significantly into Trump's personal wealth, given that he still owns 59% of the company. But I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. First, the president tried to settle some jangled nerves.
Be cool. Everything's going to work out well. The U.S. will be bigger and better than ever before.
Be cool. He followed that with a bit of stock market advice that had some nitpicky types saying insider trading.
This is a great time to buy.
And it was then the announcement came that most of Trump's tariffs would be placed on pause for 90 days, still with an across-the-board rate of 10%, except for China, where he again upped the ante.
Based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world markets, I am hereby raising the tariff charge to China by the United States of America to 125%, effective immediately.
That was Wednesday, and at first stock markets rallied, and anyone who'd taken Trump's advice to buy was making a killing. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was declaring mission accomplished.
And we saw the successful negotiating strategy that President Trump implemented a week ago today. It has brought more than 75 countries forward to negotiate. It took great courage for him to stay the course until this moment. And what we have ended up with here, as I told everyone a week ago, they're in this very spot, do not retaliate and you will be rewarded.
Do not retaliate and you'll be rewarded. It sounded a bit like a mugger saying, hand over your wallet and you won't get hurt. It started to look more and more like a shakedown every day. Trump media investors were being rewarded too as the share price climbed back above $20 US. Yet at the end of this extraordinary week, Chaz, we are still in a hugely disruptive trade dispute, quickly escalating one as well, between the world's economic and military superpowers in the United States and China.
Absolutely, although we shouldn't oversell the recovery here. The stock market is still a fair bit lower than it was before Liberation Day. It's not even halfway back, actually. And the Dow Jones has still lost more than 10% of its value since Trump took over at the beginning of the year. Also, let's not pretend that Trump just performed some huge tariff backflip. Yes, the high China tariffs are still there, and in fact they're higher, but don't forget the 10% tariffs on all imports are still there. The 25% auto tariffs and steel and aluminium tariffs are still there. The 25% tariffs on about half of Canada's and Mexico's imports, they're still there as well. In fact, the Yale Budget Lab reckons even after this supposed tariff relief, America's overall average tariff rate is still about 27%. That's the highest level since 1903, and this is only slightly different from where the average rate was before Trump's announcement yesterday. Even after allowing for Americans to buy cheaper non-Chinese products, the average tariff rate still 18.5%, which is right up there with the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs that exacerbated the Great Depression. So that's still going to be an enormous drag on the economy. Remember also, many of the parts and ingredients used by American producers come from overseas. So you're still tariffing local businesses as well. Also, that huge uncertainty that's currently haunting the American economy just became worse again. Trump effectively just announced that no one should make investment decisions for at least 90 days because he's still going to be messing with tariffs until then. Also, John, the same questions we asked a few days ago, they all still apply. Why are there 10% tariffs on countries that America has a surplus with, like Australia? Why are there tariffs on islands with no humans living on them and they're not even countries? The questions are still, don't get me wrong, reducing tariffs a bit on about 60 countries, that's a good thing. It's going to help America isolate China much more effectively. But there's still that 10% global tariff there, which means America's still fighting China with one hand tied behind its back. Remember, Trump's tariffs cover nearly 100% of all US imports, but they only cover about 13% of China's exports, the ones going to America. So what do you reckon about Trump's move?
Yeah, well, we're none the wiser as to whether this is some grand strategy because we are hearing both stories out of the Trump administration. So at least at any given time, 50% of what Trump and the people around him are saying is a bald-faced lie. Bluffers obviously don't tell you when they are bluffing because it defeats the purpose. Is Trump now, by focusing on China, simply picking a fight with the biggest guy in the prison exercise yard so everybody else, those 75 countries that Besant said are all queuing up to do a deal now? Is that, or is it because they think that actually they can do something effective with China and get China to, if not reduce its own protections, do something about currency manipulation? Or is it that they're just making it up as they're going along? There's a lot of evidence to suggest from the reporting from inside the White House this week that you had Wall Street titans like Charles Schwab, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase going to the Oval Office and saying, Mr. President, look at the bond yield, look at the market, this is catastrophic, you have to reverse course. So Trump has paused it for 90 days. Who knows what happens next? And I think there's no way for us to know because Trump doesn't know, Besant doesn't know, the markets don't know. You talked about that uncertainty. These are very, very uncertain times.
Absolutely. Although on the question that you raise about how much is a plan and how much is by the seat of their pants, well, let me try and address that. Well, according to Scott Besant, this was all part of the plan.
This was driven by the president's strategy. He and I had a long talk on Sunday, and this was his strategy all along. And that, you might even say that he goaded China into a bad position.
You might say that.
We got them exactly where we want them.
But according to Fox News' Charles Gasparino, that was absolutely not the case.
Let's be clear what happened. Who capitulated here and why? And, I don't want to say this because I'm a patriot, I'm an American, but it is the White House who capitulated based on everything I hear and all my sources. And the reason why is because of the bond market and what happened last night. That
bond market seemed to give everyone the scares. But if this is all about deal making, as suggested, where are the deals? Vietnam offered to zero out all their tariffs, and Trump's economist Peter Navarro said that offer means nothing. No deal. Does this no longer apply?
This is not a negotiation. This is a national emergency based on a trade deficit that's gotten out of control because of cheating.
I thought it was a national emergency. I thought these tariffs were America's medicine to fundamentally transform the economy. Is that no longer the case? And what happened to Trump's manly tariffs that were going to reverse America's crisis in masculinity, according to Fox News? I can't help feeling, John, that Democratic Senator Brian Schatz may have nailed it here with his sarcastic tweet paraphrasing MAGA types when he said, "Our plan is working perfectly and is just a negotiating tactic, but it's also going to be permanent and we'll be the world leader in textiles. And now there is a pause and everyone needs to chill, but we will also never back down." What do you reckon?
There's no doubt that Peter Navarro has believed in tariffs for a very, very long time. And this is his moment after years in sort of on the academic fringes in economic theory. He's now got somebody in Trump who will listen to him. And then Trump will listen to Jamie Dimon and Charles Schwab, and then he'll listen to Scott Besant. He's getting conflicting advice right now. He wants to come out of this looking strong and looking impactful. And he, in the past, has been very receptive to movements on the stock market. Trump tends to see, it seems, the stock market as being a little bit like his poll numbers. If it's up, oh, he's doing a really great job. If it's down, oh, doesn't like that. So we are at a very interesting inflection point now as to who Trump is going to listen to. We know historically he does like competing opinions and different ideas coming at him. The question is, who's the person who's in his ear as he's about to send the next tweet and roil the markets once again? Now, while all of that was dominating the news around the world this week, there was a very significant ruling from the United States Supreme Court, which essentially cleared the way for President Trump to continue using that 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members. But they did not write Trump a blank check. The court's majority placed limits on how those deportations may occur, emphasising that judicial review is required. This all comes down to the old habeas corpus, Chaz.
It does. Let me spell this out a bit. I think essentially what's happened is that the court has given Trump a practical victory by, one, not saying anything about the Alien Enemies Act at all. They've put that off for another time. And two, they've said the trial was in the wrong venue. To explain, the prisoners challenged their deportation under the Administrative Procedure Act, but the court said when you're challenging your deportation, you should make what John just referred to, a habeas corpus claim. What that means is you're challenging your imprisonment. And they said where you're supposed to make that claim is where you're being held in prison, which for most of these guys is or was in Texas, because that's where they're usually sent before being deported. And this is a practical win for the administration because it means the prisoners have to start again. They were in the wrong court. They now have to do it through the super conservative Fifth Circuit Appeals Court in Texas. Also, if you're making a habeas corpus challenge, you're supposed to only challenge your own personal deportation. You can't have a class action. So if prisoners can't get themselves a lawyer, well, they're out of luck. So that's the administration's practical win. But the court also handed the Trump administration a huge legal loss. Because let's remember what their actual position was.
It is fundamentally incompatible to have a country and have individual expulsions adjudicated by a single district court judge.
I'm just trying to figure out at what point in the system do you, because what does the Trump administration believe? Because we do have separation of powers in this country. I hear what you're saying.
Yes,
you're saying
separation
the district
of powers.
court does not
this is the judiciary
have authority.
Interfering
Stephen,
in
let me finish.
the executive function.
So Stephen Miller there, speaking for the administration, felt that individual trials interfered with Trump's executive powers. And the Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, said get stuffed. They did use other words.
Yeah.
They said every detainee must be given notice of a potential deportation within a reasonable time and in a way that allows them to actually seek habeas relief in a court before they're removed. That's a huge loss for the administration because they were very much trying to sneak those prisoners to El Salvador without a court seeing what their evidence was against those prisoners. Possibly because their evidence for a large number of those prisoners was he had tattoos. Well, that ain't going to cut it anymore.
Yeah, so it seems. And earlier today, the Supreme Court, in a subsequent order, said that the Trump administration had to facilitate the return of a 29-year-old, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He was among hundreds of those deported to El Salvadorian prisons, Venezuelans and El Salvadorians, on the unproven assumption that he was also a gang member. An immigration court had ruled that whether that was the case or not, Garcia was himself a potential victim of persecution by local gangs and therefore was to be shielded from being sent specifically to El Salvador. Well, for more, we're joined by Prakash. He's Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. He's a leading expert in the American Constitution, as well as the powers of the American presidency. Prakash, welcome to Planet America's Situation Room.
Great to be here with you, John.
So what would you say, Sai, are the immediate implications of this week's SCOTUS ruling?
Well, the Supreme Court both gave President Trump a victory and a loss. The Trump administration had been asserting that members of this gang from Venezuela, Tren de Aragua, were deportable under the Alien Enemies Act without any judicial review, and that was just for the president to decide whether you were a member of this gang or not, and the courts were not to be involved. And what happened was a class action was brought in D.C. meaning, relief was sought for the entire population of people that might be deported under this order. And the district court in D.C. granted an injunction, a temporary restraining order preventing the deportation of folks that the Trump administration might deport pursuant to the president's executive order. And, maybe 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court intervened and said, you filed your case in the wrong location. You need to file what is known as a habeas corpus petition. And that can only be filed in the place of detention, meaning where you're being detained and not in D.C. If you happen to be in D.C., you can file there. But most of the detainees are in Texas, I believe, not in D.C. So that was vacating the district court's jurisdiction or saying the district court didn't have jurisdiction was the victory. The loss was that the Trump administration ultimately agreed that the detainees had a due process right and that there would be some judicial review over whether or not they are deportable under the Alien Enemies Act.
So does this mean hundreds of potential deportees all need to go to court to basically make the same legal challenge against the government? Or do you think that class action habeas corpus challenges, like say from the ACLU, will do the trick?
Well, the class action legal challenge will be dismissed and they'll have to file individualized petitions. So it puts a tremendous burden on all the potential deportees. And of course, it means the government has to fight on an individualized basis as well. And it means that they all have to be filed in Texas, which is not as favorable a venue because the district court judges down there are more favorable to the Trump administration than the district court in D.C. was to the Trump administration's legal claims. So they're fighting as individuals in an inhospitable climate. But again, there is going to be judicial review of the deportation claims. And obviously it's possible that some courts might conclude that some of the people are deportable and some are not. Something that, might not have been possible in a class action context.
And so even if, as Attorney General Pam Bondi says, these will be fast hearings, what do you think it means for due process? And are there still questions, they were raised back during the War on Terror, as to whether non-citizens enjoy that right of habeas corpus to appear before a judge to make their case against deportations?
The big War on Terror question was, did habeas apply in Guantanamo? And Guantanamo is a military base in Cuba. It's not the sovereign territory of the United States. And so the reason why the government put the detention facility there is they thought there wouldn't be any habeas review of the detainees. But the court concluded otherwise. For aliens in the United States, they've always had due process rights, meaning they always have some right to some procedure before life, liberty, and property is taken away. And the court here said that these potential deportees have due process rights, and that if they file a habeas petition, a court will decide whether they are deportable, including whether the act itself, the Alien Enemies Act, is constitutional. The court unanimously said that these folks have due process rights and they can avail themselves of that through the habeas petition. Now, what that means is not entirely clear because they didn't specify what the due process right consisted of. The court has had a long history of requiring various things under the concept of procedural due process. And I think that will be litigated in the courts below. And it's quite possible it will then go to the Fifth Circuit, which is the circuit court that sits between the district court and the Supreme Court. And then ultimately the Supreme Court might decide. So there's going to be a lot of litigation in the wake of this decision.
So people seem to have forgotten that Judge Boasberg is still considering whether the government defied his court order when they didn't turn around that El Salvador prison plane. Can he realistically still hold the government in contempt, given that the Supreme Court has just held he shouldn't have been hearing that case in the first place?
That's a great question, Chaz, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I can imagine the doctrine permitting a judge to find someone in contempt, even if they don't have jurisdiction, because it's normally not up to the party to refuse to follow a court order based on their sense that the court doesn't have jurisdiction. But there might be doctrine on this precise question that I'm not aware of.
So we did learn earlier today in a subsequent ruling from the Supreme Court that one of the hundreds of Venezuelans who were hurriedly deported to El Salvador, this is Kilmar Garcia, a 29-year-old who in fact had been a victim of gang violence rather than being a gang member himself. the Trump administration now has to do everything they can to try and get him back from the prison in El Salvador. Given the finding in that case, do you think that this now will prevent people from being wrongfully deported on the simple allegation that they are a gang member, that they can now prove otherwise?
Well, I certainly think it makes it less likely. Of course, it's a function of whether or not these folks have counsel who can make the habeas petition argument in the first place, and then who can skillfully, argue that their client isn't deportable. Right. So they have to have a lawyer who can file this petition for them. And then they have to have a lawyer who can argue their case competently and adequately for them. And so, there's still going to be a chance, as you said, that some of them might not have lawyers. And there's still going to be a chance, as with any legal system, that someone who doesn't fit within the categories nonetheless deported because the judge got it wrong. There are errors in our judicial system, even when everybody is trying to play above board. I don't think it's implausible to say that there might be errors made, either because someone wasn't able to challenge through habeas corpus, or because the court, made a mistake in its decision making.
So, Prakash, thank you for sharing your expertise with us here on Planet America's Situation Room.
Thank you so much, guys.
President Trump has talked about the possibility of seeking a third term in the White House several times now, despite constitutional barriers. So, is that a real possibility, or is he just taunting his rivals and trolling we in the media? Trump has been saying things like this for quite a while.
It will be the greatest honor of my life to serve not once, but twice, or 3 times, or 4 times. Headlines.
Indeed, it does make headlines, even when he sounds like he is clearly joking.
I've raised a lot of money for the next race that I assume I can't use for myself, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't know. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again?
In fact, Attorney General Pam Bondi was asked about that during her Senate confirmation process.
Is President-elect Trump eligible to run for another term as president in 2028?
No, Senator, not unless they change the Constitution.
And she's right. The Constitution's 22nd Amendment seems absolutely clear on this. Section 1 stating, no person shall be elected to the office of the President more than twice. That amendment was ratified in 1951. It came after President Franklin Roosevelt died just months into his 4th term in the middle of World War II. Every other president before Roosevelt had followed the example set by America's first president, George Washington, to only serve 2 4-year terms. So Trump, he was elected in 2016, he lost in 2020, and he won again in 2024. So that's twice. Case closed. Not necessarily. First, the Constitution can be amended again. Not easily, but it can. That amendment would have to be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, then ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of America's 50 states. So that would require a lot of Democrats going along with this idea of a third term for Trump and everybody else, and that is highly, highly unlikely. And while it is still being largely treated as a bit of a joke, bit of a troll, Trump maintains he is not joking.
The president telling NBC's Kristen Welker, quote, there are methods which you could do it, when asked to clarify, saying, I'm not joking. Later adding, it's far too early to think about it.
And Pam Bondi, also with a little bit of a smile, says, well, they'll have to take a look at it, but he will probably leave after this term, probably.
President Trump has served 1 full term. He's on his 2nd full term. He's a very smart man, and I wish we could have him for 20 years as our president, but I think he's going to be finished probably after this term.
Probably.
Well, the Constitution, we'd have to look at the Constitution.
It would be a heavy lift, and whether you get 2/3 of the Senate and House to go along with you, but is the concession that that's really the only way to do it?
It'd be a heavy lift.
A heavy lift indeed. But it's not a no, because there are other ways you can do it as well. In theory, Trump could run again and just dare Congress and the Supreme Court not to allow his election if he were to win. Or he could, again in theory, run as J.D. Vance's vice president, have J.D. elected as president of the United States, then have J.D. step down in favour of Trump, invoking the 25th Amendment after they're both sworn in, thus skirting around that twice-elected restraint in the 22nd Amendment. As for Donald Trump, well, he says he doesn't want to talk about it, despite the fact that he keeps on talking about it. And he's certainly not ruling it out as a possibility.
We have almost 4 years to go, and that's a long time. But despite that, so many people are saying, you've got to run again. They love the job we're doing. Most importantly, they love the job we're doing.
The people are demanding it. Everybody's saying you should run again. So what to make of all of that? Could Trump really try and stay in power after 2028? Obviously, he did try and overturn an election loss and cling to power in 2020, so it's not without precedent here. But is this possibly, Chaz, simply about him avoiding the second-term curse of every president, it seems, that very early on, maybe even as early as the midterms next year, he'll be seen as yesterday's man, a bit of a lame duck?
Well, firstly, I think you're absolutely right that the motivation here from Trump's point of view is to just seem less impotent as a potential lame duck, to try and keep his powder dry as long as he can, so there's that threat, so people treat him like he's the president and not like he's on his way out. So I think you're right about that. But let's talk about the legals for a second, because I think there is another element we should mention. Yes, the 22nd Amendment does only stop a two-termer from being elected, as you said. So if Trump could somehow get parachuted into the presidency, perhaps by being elected as J.D. Vance's VP, as you said, then the Trump fans hope that theoretically he could maybe get around the 22nd Amendment. But here's the other element. The 12th Amendment says no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. So that suggests if Trump can't be president, then he can't be vice president either. So that eliminates the J.D. Vance scheme. Now, of course, the Trump fans are then saying, well, what does ineligible to the office of president mean? Does that mean ineligible to run? In which case, sure, the 22nd Amendment combines with the 12th Amendment to count Trump out for sure. No J.D. Vance president scheme. Or does it mean ineligible to be president if he wasn't parachuted in which case he gets around that restriction and the being J.D. Vance's vice president scheme could still potentially work. That's what they say. Now, to me, this feels like this would obviously be against both the spirit and the intention of both the 22nd and 12th Amendments, and the Supreme Court are meant to be originalists, so they're supposed to care about the intention of the Constitution. I don't think they'd go for it. I also suspect Trump might be on the nose by 2027 anyway, but let's say he's still popular in 2027. I suspect we may be discussing these theories again.
Yep, just as we were as to whether being criminally convicted was going to disqualify him. They said, oh, look, he's over 35, that's all it says. He's a natural-born citizen, that's all it says. They'll have those arguments, no doubt. One of the other issues that Trump talks about a lot, and nobody's really sure if he is serious or not, is Canada becoming part of the United States. Trump has made a number of comments like this in the context of talking about the tariffs that he's imposed on imports from Canada.
But look, what I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection. We don't need them to build our cars. I'd rather see Detroit or South Carolina or any one of our Tennessee, any one of our states build the cars. They could do it very easily. We don't need them. As a state, it's different. As a state, it's much different. And there are no tariffs. So I'd love to see that, but some people say that would be a long shot.
A long shot for sure, but it is a shot that America has taken several times before, with both diplomatic and military attempts over the years to take over their northern neighbour in both the 18th and the 19th century. Well, Eliot Cohen is one of America's more influential academics and military historians. In the early 2000s, he was a prominent member of that neoconservative movement that guided much of the foreign policy of then-President George W. Bush. Eliot Cohen was also a senior counsellor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He's written about the history of US-Canadian relations in this month's Atlantic Monthly, and he's with us now. Eliot Cohen, welcome to Planet America's Situation Room.
Happy to be with you.
Why do you think Donald Trump is fixating on this idea of Canada as America's 51st state? Does he simply like the idea of that massive combined country on a map from Mexico up to Alaska, or are there particular strategic or other reasons why he would want Canada to be part of the United States?
So I think it's always a mistake to read too much strategy into Trump. You know, he's a man of whims and resentments and brainstorms that lead nowhere. He's a much more erratic man, and I think the temptation that people from overseas, but also a lot of Americans have, is to think that there's some sort of broad scheme when there's just these eruptions. In addition, because people get very upset when he says these things, he enjoys trolling them. So he knows he begins talking about that, people are going to get indignant, and they're usually the kinds of people that he and his followers despise. So in a certain way, you make a big mistake by playing to it. Having said all that, there's a bit of a kernel, and the kernel is this: he would like to see the United States look the way it probably looked during his childhood, so 50s, early 60s, in which the United States was this extremely prosperous manufacturing power, with the factories of Pittsburgh belching smoke and producing all kinds of stuff. And then there's a part of the international vision, which is really more or less out of the 1920s and 1930s. And in the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of Americans, including the American military, by the way, had a very, what some people have called a hemispherist view of what American foreign and national security policy would be. It wasn't precisely isolationist. I mean, it was in large measure, but the idea was, the United States should be dominant in the Western Hemisphere. That includes being rigorous about the Monroe Doctrine, but also the Panama Canal, I think Greenland, Canada, those are all parts of it. And let's remember, the United States did not give up really on acquiring Canada, I think, until after World War I. I mean, as late as the 1890s, there were people who hoped that the Canadians would decide that they wanted to be part of the United States. The United States tried to purchase Greenland several times, and then once in the 19th century, very seriously in 1946, because of the kind of crucial strategic geography of Greenland being where it is with regard to the Arctic and the North Atlantic. Of course, it was the Americans who built the Panama Canal and indeed created Canada. There are security interests that the United States has there and security obligations.
Let's indulge in the hypothetical, though, Eliot Cohen. What would be the implications of a united Canada and America? Trump talks about a 51st state, but there are, I think, 9 Canadian provinces that are bigger than the smallest American state, Wyoming. So we could, in fact, be looking at the 51st through to the 61st American state.
Well, like I said, it's ridiculous. But okay, let's say if you had 10 Canadian states, boy, that's 20 more senators who could vote to convict in the third impeachment of Donald Trump. So that wouldn't end up so well. It would be, in general, Canada's a much more left-wing country than the United States is. There are various kind of free speech restrictions and so on. So it would be adding 40 million progressives into the American political mix, and who the hell would want that? It would transform American politics, of course, and if those 40 million people were really unhappy about being there, it would be even worse. The truth is, all the strategic benefits that the United States could conceivably get from being unified with Canada, we actually get with an alliance relationship. In the same way with Greenland, we can have as many military bases there as we want. The Danes and the Greenlanders, for that matter, have been very clear about that. And similar with the Panama Canal Zone, there are no benefits. There are only the costs of the kind of political friction and anger and resentment and everything that's unpredictable. When I was a boy, you could cross that border with a driver's license, if that. I mean, I remember I grew up in New England, and we would frequently go to Canada on holiday. It is still a very open border by any normal standard. So there would be actually no gains and only the loss that you get from, trying to incorporate a population with really different views of the role of government, some very fundamental views of things like free speech, and who would, I am quite sure, be very unhappy about being incorporated into the United States of America.
Eliot, if these tensions and Canadian anxiety over Trump's rhetoric continues, could you possibly see Canada one day being driven more into attaching itself to Europe instead?
Well, I think that's actually quite serious. I mean, the political consequences already have been really very striking. Justin Trudeau, who kind of embodies sort of left-wing Canadian politics, was extraordinarily unpopular. There's a reason why he got forced out, and he's replaced by Mark Carney, who's a central banker, which is not the most charismatic of professions. And the Canadian Conservatives were really very well positioned to win. They have a very good candidate, Mr. Poilievre. And this may have completely turned Canadian politics upside down, because although Poilievre is not a Trumpian figure, he is like a normal conservative, which is kind of what I am. But it's quite conceivable that the Liberals will come in again. So that's the first and most important thing. Second thing, though, I think it is, and there has been Canadian talk of this, of reaching out more to Europe and doing free trade deals and all the rest. And I will not be surprised if something like that happens. Again, we've been talking somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the truth is the damage that Trump is doing in the second administration is much worse than in the first administration. And the reason why is that although I think most people, including in Australia, could say, okay, the first time you elect somebody like that, it's unfortunate, but we can understand you didn't know what he was going to be like. Well, now you know what he's going to be like, and you elected him again. He is much more reckless, much more aggressive than he was in the first term. And I think this is doing lasting damage to the trust that all of our allies have had in us. I mean, it's what I feel when I talk to Canadians, when I talk to Europeans, a little bit less when talking to Australians, but it's there as well.
Also, Eliot, it does appear to me at least that in dealing with the various threats and issues raised by Trump, Canada and Mexico never seem to coordinate their response, and that leaves them open to a divide and conquer strategy. Is that your perception as well? And if so, why might that be?
That's an interesting observation. Obviously, I'm not privy to what goes on between the two governments, but it does sort of look that way. I think the reason for it is that the history of the two countries vis-a-vis the United States are really very different. So, despite everything we've been talking about, the fact is that the U.S.-Canadian relationship for over a century has been very, very close, very relaxed, and friendly. There are disputes about fisheries and stuff like that, but that's really trivial. The relationship with Mexico has always been a lot more fraught. I mean, there's a large part of what is now the United States that once belonged to Mexico. The United States has used force, including in the 20th century, in Mexico. Mexico is a very, very different kind of society than Canadian society. It's a much more of a history of revolutionary turmoil and all that. But more importantly, nobody really worries about the Canadian border, despite what Trump says about fentanyl and stuff. People do worry about the Mexican border. I mean, the combination of illegal immigration and absolutely the drug cartels moving stuff in to feed the American market, that is a bona fide security problem. And I think the result is the relationship just has a very different flavor. The other thing is that the American and Canadian economies are really intertwined. So are the American and the Mexican economies, but in a rather different way. For a long time, we've had a whole bunch of factories that have been set up just south of the border to feed the American market. There's some of that in Canada, but it's not really nearly the same kind of thing. So the two countries are in different places. The psychology is different. The fundamental attitudes towards the United States, I think, are really quite different. And then finally, the personalities are very, very different. Although it's true, Mark Carney's a technocrat. Claudia Sheinbaum is is a technocrat. I suspect that they've had different styles in dealing with Trump. And one has to remember, in dealing with Donald Trump, personalities matter an awful lot.
Eliot Cohen, thank you for being with us on Planet America's Situation Room.
It's been a real pleasure, and regards to all my Australian friends out there, of whom I have quite a few.
Now that Planet America has been moved from the old Foval office to the Situation Room, we thought it might be a good idea to find out a bit about what it is and what it does. The White House Situation Room is usually referred to by its acronym WHSR, or WHIZZR. But we decided not to call our show Planet America's WHIZZR. The real room was established by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba.
From the sea and by parachute, the rebels have struck along the coast within 90 miles of Havana. Initial accounts of the fighting sketchy.
One of the many reasons the CIA-backed Cuban exiles failed to oust Communist leader Fidel Castro was a lack of real-time intelligence to inform decision-making. The Situation Room, it was hoped, would change that at a time when Cold War tensions were growing over a divided Berlin.
East of the wire, a no man's land of bare earth will make it all but impossible for anyone to escape to the west.
Some presidents, like Lyndon Johnson, spent hours on end in the Situation Room. Johnson pored compulsively over information about the war in Vietnam, while his successor, Richard Nixon, hated to be in the cramped, windowless space. Nixon didn't even like the presidential Oval Office, preferring instead to work in the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door.
Mrs. Nixon, please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The technology has changed a lot over the years.
Hello, Margaret Thatcher. How is Nancy?
Just fine.
While the Situation Room itself remained pretty much the same for almost half a century, until a major renovation in 2007 expanded it from 1 to 3 conference rooms with more working space, private rooms and booths to make secure phone and video calls.
So we call them Superman tubes.
We didn't have the budget to make them too. So, this is what is known as the Executive Conference Room, where the National Security Council, including the VP, Secretaries of Defence, State, Treasury and Energy, and chaired by the President, meets to dissect and discuss the latest developments and conflicts around the world, often with the top military leaders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's safe to say that many of the world's biggest calls are made in the Situation Room. And that is all for Planet America's Weekend Edition. If you missed Wednesday night's show, it's now on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And then next Wednesday night's Planet America is on ABC TV at the very special later time of 10:30 p.m. after the Australian election leaders debate, and a special edition of Insiders, and a special edition of The Weekly. But we are going to be up on iView and online at 8 p.m, so I'll see you there.
Yeah, one final program note as well. No weekend edition for the next 2 weeks with Good Friday, then Anzac Day, but we will be here on Wednesday night. So check your local guides as times are bouncing around just a bit at the moment. Bye-bye.